Hey, welcome to Gold's Garage. Just had an opportunity today to do this. We've been thinking about it, and Mike kind of inspired me to do it today. I have my Camaro out of the garage. It spends 99% of its life under roof, but took it for a little ride today. And you've seen it in the background in a lot of my videos. It's usually in my shop. So there's lots of history I thought we'd share with you. One of the things, it's almost identical to Tony Guzzo's 68Z28. That is the subject of many of my videos right now that we're working on. So the history is, I bought this car in 1969. I was 20 years old, still working and part-time and going to school. Worked at Texaco Garage at the time. And I had it, previous to that, I actually had a 67 Camaro, 327 4-speed car that I drag raced a lot. And I got a good price for it, so I sold it. And at that time in 1969, the best value for money was for $29.95 you could buy a brand new Roadrunner or a brand new Dodge Start 340 for $29.95. No tax. There was no tax. That was what the car costs, and you just basically, I don't know, $10 preparation fee or something, and you drove it away. So I actually ordered the Dodge Start. I lived in Sault Ste. Marie, which is about 8 hours from Toronto, and paid a deposit. And when I got down there, I wanted a 390 or 391 rear end and a few other things. And the car that I ordered wasn't available, and they didn't have it. They didn't really have the car at all. And so after fighting all day, I got my money back. I got my deposit back. But I didn't have a car. So we were driving around that night, and we actually saw this car in a Chevrolet dealership, but it was a used car at that time. It's a 68 Camaro. This was 1969. I'd love to be able to buy, the year was 1969. I'd love to buy a 69, of course, but I couldn't afford it. At the same trip, my brother-in-law brought a brand new 69 Z28 with a 410 rear end, with the Ram air hood and all that stuff. Paid exactly $4,000 cash out the door for it. So this was used. I think I paid $34.95 for it at the time. And couldn't really afford it actually, but I bought it anyways. So still had a year left of college, and over that winter, I drag raced it. That summer I drag raced a little bit at the end of the year, but I wasn't really prepped for it. So I rebuilt the 302. It was my second rebuild. The first rebuild, I had to have an engine to keep me going all winter. I didn't have two cars. I couldn't even afford one car. So I built the 307 from kind of scrap and reclaim parts. Put some of the 302 parts on it, like the intake manifold, and drove it all winter while I was rebuilding the 302. And the 302 went pretty good. I fooled around with these General Kinetics experimental, they called legal cheater camshafts at the time. So the idea was, if you're running stock class, you had the right lift and duration, but the duration, the area under the curve was a lot bigger because the valve lifted a lot faster. And that rattled the valve springs out of it. And I dropped the valve at 6,600 RPM and basically grenaded the 302. Had to put a sleeve in the block, fix it. I did fix it and use it again. Didn't use that camshaft again for sure. So I also had a 488, put a 488 rear end in it at the time. And drag racing back then was a lot simpler than it is today. I think we were limited to about a 6-inch tire, and nobody was spraying the track with fine tar or anything. It turned high 12s, and it was a pretty fun car. But it became impractical for my lifestyle later because I still had the 48 rent in it, so I did sell it and lost track of it for many, many years. And found it again by chance in 1987. So fast forward 15 or 16 years, something like that. Since then, I was able to keep track of it. I always dreamed of buying it back. I tried to negotiate the deal with the owner numerous times, and finally in 2015, after I moved here and set up my shop, we were racing late model stock cars at the time. I made a deal. I went up, drove back up to where it was, Sault Ste. Marie, an 8-hour drive with my race car trailer, and brought it back here. It had sat in a garage for the license plates were 1999, so it had sat in a garage since back then. But it was nice and solid. This car's never been crashed or damaged in any way. It wasn't rusted out. It was basically solid, but it was in need of a restoration. So I did that, of course. I had shop and by now I have a nice shop to do that. Took the frame off of it. Basically rebuilt every component of the car. At that time it had, when I bought it back, it actually had an L78 396 in it. And how did that happen? After I actually sold it, I was doing stuff like I am now, fixing up cars for guys. And I installed the L78. I actually sold the L78 to the owner at the time. Back then, nobody cared about numbers, matching, or any of that stuff. We just looked at a 68 car in 1972 like a used old car. And it basically, why would anybody want one when you can get a new one? Anyway, it had an L78 in it. And when I bought it back, I wanted to sell that L78 and made my very first video for the sole purpose of finding a buyer for it. And it was it was actually an original engine of a 69 Chevelle that I bought in Michigan that got wrecked. So that's the story. So it is, like Tony's, very, very original when I restored it. All the suspension, the rear end was a 488. When I bought it back, still had a 488 gear in it. I did replace that with a 355. The M21 transmission was still in it. It's going to live forever because it's down in my basement right now. And I've got an M20 transmission. So that gives me a better gear ratio for the street. M21 transmission is not necessarily the best for street use. So the M20 has got a 252 first gear. It's a great transmission, and that works for me. The M21 is going to be safe forever. As far as the engine goes, we were late model stock car racing at that time, so the CT400 was a popular engine. Also, the street version of that is the ZZ6. And by the time I quit late model stock car racing, I had 3 of them, so one of them ended up in this car. So I dynoed that engine. It made 453 horsepower. And at that time it did, to be fair, it had a single plane intake manifold. I have replaced that with a dual plane because it's better to drive on the street. So it probably makes a little bit less than that now. But that's a nice, it makes a great street engine. As those ZZ6 engines have a hydraulic roller cam. They're only 212, 218 or something duration. Not even 500 thou lift on the intake. One of the things that's not great about it is it doesn't have that nice authentic Z28 rumble that Tony's engine is going to have when we finish it. Because it's a roller cam, it's a lot quieter. But when you step on the gas, it goes pretty good. It's 450 horsepower is all you need on the street. And it's fun to drive, and it lives a charmed life in my shop. Probably, I think I drove it 600 miles last year, so it's going to last a lot longer than I am anyway, that's for sure. So when I restored it, I tried to keep it as authentic and original as I could, but so some of the stuff is kind of patina, but I did make some changes. The engine I mentioned already is what we call a 604 crate engine, or in the GM Performance catalog is essentially a ZZ6. And they have those GM Performance fast burn heads. That's why they make power. They've got D-shaped ports, and they're only just under 10 to 1 pressure ratio, hydraulic roller camshaft. That's not a big radical camshaft at all, but they work nice, well past 6,500 RPM. And this is the most popular engine used in all late model, called pro late model stock car racing all over North America. And the rev limit for them by the rules is 6,400 RPM. And basically, everybody that races one is hitting the chip long before they get to the flag. So they're using every bit of that every lap. Forged crankshaft, of course, 4-bolt main bearings. So they're a nice engine. The way I'm treating it, it'll last forever. But when I restored it, for example, the radiator, I could have put aluminum radiator in for a lot less than it cost me to have this radiator. It was the original 4-core radio that came with the Z28 restored. I did do one thing. I installed power steering. Didn't have it when I had it new. I never noticed it. But 50 years later, it's a ball. It's tough to drive. Not tough to drive, but when you're parking or something without power steering with a car like this with big tires, it was hard. So I did put power steering on it, and I did replace. One of the problems with 68 Camaros, the alternator was located off the header on the driver's side, and they were vulnerable to throwing belts because those 302s went 7,000 RPM. And when they did that, a lot of times they would flip the belt over or throw a belt. So I did put a serpentine belt system on this, and I've never had to even touch it since then. I did also put MSD in the ignition in it. Probably didn't need it. It was running okay. But what MSD really does for you, more than high-end performance, MSD prevents you from following spark plugs at low speed. Multiple sparks that occur, why they call it MSD, multiple spark discharge. Multiple sparks occur when the plug fires. Okay, that makes sure all the mixture gets burned at low RPM. That's tough to burn because it's not compressed at low RPM or low speed or at idle. And so MSD helps prevent spark plugs from fouling. At high RPM, those multiple sparks don't mean much at 7,000 RPM because there's no time for them to have an effect really. But they do prevent, when you're doing city driving, low speed driving, idling, etc., they do prevent the fouling of spark plugs. So that's really the motivation for me to put MSD in. Other than that, everything in the car, for example, the brake booster, I rebuilt it instead of replaced it. All the suspension parts, I had the 68 Z28s had 4-piston brake calipers. They basically had the Corvette calipers. Could have replaced them cheaper than I had them rebuilt and put stainless steel sleeves in them. And I did that. I had the rear springs rebuilt. I rebuilt the rear end myself, changed all the bearings, and once again converted the gear ratio from 488 to 355. Transmission, I just replaced it. I did put a new Hurst 4-speed transmission, that shifter that's made for this car. When I owned it the first time, somebody gave me one that was made for another car. It didn't really fit, so I just kind of hacked up to make it fit. So I fixed all that when I did it this time. I bought the correct shifter and repaired the tunnel and all that stuff. A hush mat under the carpeting, totally solid. When I had the car restored, we took the front clip entirely off. There was nothing forward of the firewall. And when I went to the body shop, it went in multiple pieces, and the body shop painted it. Took them 7 months anyway, for whatever that's worth, to do it and put it back together for me. And that's how it got restored. So, but there was absolutely no body work, no patching at all required anywhere, floor, trunk, fenders, or anything. It's a matter of just refinishing the surfaces. So, kind of the theme of this story, I actually made a short video a long time ago when I didn't have expert guys helping me out with my video editing and production and stuff. And I think it was, found my own barn find car, my own car in a barn find. And that's pretty much what it was. I did kind of keep track of it. I talked to the guy over the years, but I hadn't seen the car for 30 or more years when I went up there to get it. My son did. He lives in the Sioux, so he went up and contacted the guy, sent me some pictures of it. Wasn't very impressive sitting in that barn with all that dust and all that stuff on it. So lost and found, basically. I kind of give up hope of ever owning it again. I was actually looking at buying another Camaro Hulk of some kind and starting from scratch and restoring it. And luckily, I made one more shot at trying to buy it from the owner, and it worked out. Mike's going to show the interior. It came with a console, and when you're drag racing, that just gets in the way. So I took that out. And back then, things like that didn't matter. I don't even know where it went. It actually had the original Ram Air deal. In '69, they had the Ram Air hood, but in '68, call it Ram Air, I guess. But the call induction hood, right where the MSD box is, actually behind that. I covered it. There's an opening, and I had the right breather. And Heartbeat City had one for sale, NOS one at the time. They wanted $6,000 for it, so that kind of dissuaded me from doing that. So they were a nuisance to put on and off back in the day, but if you're in a road race and Trans-American road racing, you're probably well worthwhile. Well, one of the other things is, of course, if you watch the videos about Tony's 302, I mentioned in the last video that's going to come out soon, when I had this car appraised, the appraiser told me if I had the original numbers matching 302 or numbers matching 302, it would be worth about 50% more than it is this way. Uh, so that's pretty enticing, and I actually did start collecting the parts. I had a 678 block. It wasn't an MO block, but it was a 678 block. I had the 1178 crankshaft. I had the heads, and I added it all up. And it's, as Tony knows, it's not cheap to authenticate the original 302. And plus, I build it fairly radically. As I said, this engine makes 450 horsepower or so, maybe a little bit less. And I would probably sacrifice 100 horsepower, close to that. So a lot of expense. And as far as utilization goes, I'm happy with it the way it is. It would definitely be worth more as a 302 or correct 302. But as my other customer, Robert Sentis, is finding a date coded correct numbers, matching numbers correct block for these cars is getting really, really tough. So unless I can do it correctly, the 678 block I had didn't have the right code on it. So it would be the right casting block, but other than that. So I basically aborted the idea and probably never will. It's a fun car to drive. Overall gear ratio, 252 times 355 is a good number. On the highway, 3,000 is about 3,000 RPMs, close to 70 miles an hour. So it's a nice cruiser, and I don't drive it hard anymore at all. Anyways, lives a charmed life, as I mentioned already. I do zap it up to 6,500 once in a while, and it's always fun to do that. And now I'm going to take you for a little ride. She had to stop for gas. So one difference in cars in the old days, like this one anyway, modern cars have the fuel filler at least on the left side or right side. These cars had the tank and the filler in the middle, so you got to make sure you park. The hose is not very long anymore, so you got to make sure you park in the right place. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is that almost all Z28s came with M21 transmission, which is a close ratio. M22, they call that the rock crusher. It had the same ratios, only the M22 had less helix angle on the gears. They weren't actually spur gears. And the purpose of that was to reduce the more helix angle you have, the more thrust it puts on the end of the transmission. So for road racing, they wanted to get rid of that thrust, so they used. They also use a larger section of gear tooth, DP, which is diametral pitch of the gear. So it's a different section of gear to make it tougher. Anyway, so the transmission in it is an M20. So in GM, Chevrolet, in this year anyways, I'm pretty sure this is a fact, somebody will tell me if it's not. If you ordered a car with 373 rear end ratio or more, in other words, 373, 456, 410, 488, whatever, then you automatically got an M21 transmission, wide ratio transmission. If you ordered a car with 308, 323, 355, or down, even 273, whatever, anything less than 355 or down, then you automatically got an M20 transmission. So the M20 has a 2.52 to 1 first gear ratio, and the M21 has a 2.2. And I've made videos before on this. What you need is overall torque multiplication in first gear. Your number should be at least 8 or 9 to 1. And therefore, if you have a high-end first gear, like a 220, then you need more gear ratio in the rear. Now, why the heck did they do that? Z28s were supposed to be race cars, and people keep forgetting that. They designed them for Trans-American road racing. So an M21 gives you better launch off the starting line or on the drag strip or whatever. But they weren't building for that. They were building for Trans-American road racing. So Trans-American road racing, they take the green flag at probably 60 or 70 miles an hour when they even start. So they don't care about that. What they care about is the change in gear ratio with each gear change. So if you go from 220 to 1 in going 1 to first to second, second to third, third to fourth, of course, then the difference in gears is going to be a lot less than if you go from 252, because the gear ratios, that's why they called it close ratio transmission. The M21 was close ratio. So the RPM drop between shifts would be less. And in road racing, where you're maybe on a straightaway going 140 miles an hour and you go into a corner that's 30 miles an hour, obviously getting back through those gears, you want those gear ratios to be close together so you have the minimum RPM drop between gear changes. So M21 transmission close ratio, great gear for Trans-American road racing. Not really good on the street unless, as I did and many other guys did who had Z28s, put a 488 rear end in it. Tony Buzzo's Z28 has a 456, which is just about the same thing, almost the same thing. And with a close ratio transmission, with a 456 gear, you have to multiply first gear ratio by rear end ratio and get a total, and his total will be just fine. I don't know what it is right now, but 456 times 220, somewhere like 10 to 1 or something like that. So that works. And that's why close ratio transmissions aren't necessarily the best thing on the street unless you have a really high numerical ratio rear end or final drive rear gear ratio or whatever. So, and we're back home. Okay, one of the other things about Z28s, let's get that right because I'm going to get hammered for that. So in most of the world, it's Z. In the United States, it's Z. If you live south of the 49th parallel, it's Z. And For my American friends, I apologize to you for calling it Zed, but that's just who we are. But one of the things that's not just Z28s, but cars like this, are they original and authentic or are they clones? And that's always a big factor because nowadays restoration companies can do a pretty good job of convincing you that the car you're buying is an original. I've been at high-end auctions with guys that are professional buyers and sellers, get fooled by this. So one of the ways that if you're looking at a Camaro Z28 is this. In 1968 and 69, I'm pretty sure 69, anyway, 68 for sure, the only Camaro that came with 15-inch wheels and tires was a Z28. Even if you bought a 427 L88 from Berger Chevrolet or something, they came with 14-inch tires, unless you replace them, of course. So one way I can prove it is I got pictures of myself driving it on the drag strip in 1969, and the 69 license plate was on it at the time. So I look a little different than I do now. But anyway, here's one way you can tell. So inside the glove box, this little patch right here, you can pretty well tell it's an original. You can actually buy this little decal, aftermarket decal, and it specifies E70 15-inch wheels and tires. It's the purpose of the decal is to tell you what tire pressures you're supposed to have. So if you're looking at a Camaro and you're not sure if it's a correct Z28 or Z28, that's one way that you might be able to tell. If that decal's brand new, a pretty good chance it's not original. You can see by looking at this one that it is original. I also still have the original manual at the time, by the way. That came with the car when I bought it and was with it when I sold it, and still here when I bought it back. Okay, thank you very much for coming for a ride with us and sharing my description of my prized possession. Every car guy my age would love to have the hot rod that they had back when they were a teenager, I'm sure, or a young man. And fortunately, I am lucky enough to have that. So thank you for sharing it. Please like and subscribe to my channel. We love sharing stuff with our viewers. We're gaining ground every day, but we have to keep doing that to make it make sense. So if you can give me a like, all the other stuff that you can do for me, subscribe, share it with somebody, that all helps to make doing this a lot more fun. So thank you for watching.